America still has a good heart. There's still a lot going on that is very positive, and it's easy to lose track of that because the politics and what you see on the national level can be so negative and so sort of relentless and difficult.
Mhm.
So, but when I go into lab every day, it's these same very smart, very talented people who want to make a place for themselves in the world and are doing all the right things to get there. And so I'm hopeful.
I'm Laura Forcum, president of the Independence Center and a former marketing professor.
I'm Lauren Hall, professor of political science and author of the Substack, The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life.
This is We Made This Political, a podcast about making politics more about flourishing and less about power.
We talk about living together in families, communities, and as citizens, drawing from our backgrounds in psychology and political science, and as parents.
We're so glad to have Kristen Kroll back with us. She is a professor of developmental biology at Washington University, St. Louis. Her PhD is in developmental neurobiology from Berkeley, and she focuses on the development and disorders of the human brain. And lately, she has turned her focus to issues of access and equity in the STEM fields. And so obviously, there's way more than we could cover in just one podcast. I'm not sure how we thought we would do that, but we're so glad to have you back, Kristen.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we were thinking, Kristen, maybe you could do just a little recap about I know last time we kind of talked about sort of the assault on the sciences. Actually academia as a whole. And then I think this time we were going to move into some questions about sort of equity in academia and STEM, and talking a little bit more about something that's become your passion in recent years. But it's been sort of a through line throughout your life, I think. So, but anyway, give us a really quick overview of the destruction of the academic project in America. Not to get too dark.
Pressing topic to recap.
Right, what a happy start.
It's really been something that I didn't anticipate we were going to see in my lifetime. I grew up. I was born in 1966. I grew up in the 70s during second wave feminism. I come from this small town. We were not wealthy, and I got into sciences through my passion and, really help from a number of excellent mentors at the undergrad level at Northwestern, and then at the grad level at Berkeley. And, then, in my job at WashU. And what we've seen over the last year has been an unparalleled gutting of a scientific research enterprise that has really been the wonder of the world, that emerged from the 1920s onward, and especially through the space race. What we've seen this year with our current administration has been just an all-out assault, regardless of any, merit of the claims that they're making. We've seen a 40% budget cut of the NIH proposed by Trump. We've seen, even though 99% of the discoveries that are taken into industry come from NIH federal funding. We've seen our international scholars taken, off the streets, detained, threatened, to the point where there's a real brain drain in the United States now, which is really tragic because my whole life it's been the case that we could recruit people from anywhere because they were like, oh, the United States, that's a place I want to go and do science. And, now we're seeing the exact opposite because we've made the political climate such that people really are rethinking their life choices. And to see a whole generation really even people who are Native Americans, like one of my graduate students, not Native Americans, but American citizens who come from situations like the one that I came from and are really rethinking their life choices, are really rethinking whether they can stay in the United States to do science. I mean, it's incontrovertible that the NIH has been an unparalleled public good for the United States. For every $1 of NIH funding spent, we produce more than $2.50 of return on investment in terms of investments and discoveries that are commercialized. And that trickles out to every of the 50 states. We also are seeing a case where, ironically, because the blue states are funding a lot of this, the places like rural Missouri, like my own, state, there are places in the rural areas where hospitals are being shuttered because these Medicaid and Medicare cuts and the other things that the government are doing are going to make it impossible to keep, ironically, again, hospitals operating in the red parts of our state. So I'm in a little blue, blue to purple kind of dot in my red state of Missouri. And so we actually at this point bring people in to do complex medical procedures to our area. And some of them are coming from 3-4 hours out. They're literally driving across the state to be in St. Louis to get training at these few places or to get medical care at these few places that are available. So we're really just seeing at a wholesale level that isn't just, like, let's own the libs and we're going to trash the scientific infrastructure. This is like people's ability to get health care. Like if you're in these red states in a couple of years, you're not going to be able to get medical procedures. You're not going to be able to get health care. These hospitals are closing. They're closing procedures. And if you think that these folks who set this up and are doing this care about you, you are wrong because they do not care. So that would be my kind of, somewhat politically pointed, but also really, I think fact-based summary of what we've been through over the last 6 months, which is really unprecedented. It
Yeah.
wasn't something, even when I saw it was kind of starting to happen, I didn't think it was going to happen. And so, I think it's been a shock to us all.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned something that's really important, I think, for listeners to grapple with, which is that like we often think about STEM funding as sort of primarily affecting academia, or like there's like long-term implications for research and things like that. But you pointed out what I think is a really important issue as well, which is that a lot of academics toggle between clinical practice and research, and so there's a kind of network effect or I don't know exactly what the word, like there's a compounding effect to a lot of these attacks. And so when you take, for example, the cuts to NIH funding and then you add in cuts to Medicaid, part of my research looks at at maternity care regulations. And so if you, 40, I think a lot of people don't realize that 40% of pregnant women get Medicaid. So if you slash Medicaid, you are cutting the major way that women, 40% of pregnant women get access to prenatal care. But then you add in the fact that, there's no incentive for obstetricians to practice in rural areas. And so, and then you add in really punitive and poorly written abortion regulations. And you have just this total drain of people who can provide any kind of obstetrics care, for example.
Right.
So we have massive deserts. And so it's a brain drain, not just in the research area, but in the clinical area too.
Yeah.
Because why would you? Like if you're
Right.
if you're a good obstetrician, why the hell would you move to Missouri? Right? You wouldn't. And in fact, you'd move out. And so I think people need to see the connections between like all of these different kinds of actions, and it really has a compounding effect on provision of care. But so like long-term research, which of course we really, really want in order to keep cures coming and treatments coming, but also just like immediate provision of care for primarily rural populations, primarily red populations.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a really weird, like, blind spot.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
It does
Chip.
seem to be.
Oh,
Sorry,
yeah,
go ahead, Laura.
No,
No,
it does. It does seem to be more rooted in political taking than it does in actual concerns about the efficiency or efficacy of these organizations. And I think that's really important to acknowledge as you try to figure out how to respond. And I saw Chip's point about how you address this without further deepening divisions. And I think it's really hard because the initial move was a divisive one. But one of the things that makes me think is that these are really complex, arcane federal systems and procedures that fund a lot of these entities. And so what happens is like lobbying crops up that asks for further concessions, further, more funding, just like it's a system, right? And it keeps making itself more complex as a way to stay funded. And one of the things that makes me wonder is like a lot of effort was directed at convincing members of Congress to continue to fund these things. But like maybe what we didn't do was talk to the general public about the importance of science and what science brings to our country, even when it's not the obvious things, right? Like it's not that everything has a clear path to monetization. And while monetization certainly matters, we unfortunately can't do much discovery and exploration in a way that says like, no, we're only going to study the things that are profitable, right?
Right.
Like we just don't know.
Right. Right. Yeah. You have to study a wide range of things to be on the cutting edge and to be finding the next cures. And you have to have these medical centers that really do provide both the care. I mean, they literally are the boots on the ground, providing health care to women. And often in, conditions that we've been under for the last 10 years, where really, with abortion laws being rolled back, with women's options being limited, particular types of healthcare have become much harder to come by, even without the fall of Roe. Even before that, we were to the point where in Missouri there was one place where you could go to the Planned Parenthood in St. Louis, but really, the right has worked over the last 40 years, really, since Reaganomics, and you could argue even before, to really strip these provisions away from people who need it in a very real way. And, I don't want to make this political, but, your whole podcast is we make
Yeah,
this political. So I guess
we make it, we make a lot of things political. That's what we
try,
do.
in my day job, I really try to make it non-political. I try to make it like, look, you all want healthcare, we all want discoveries and cures. We all want things that, that make our society better. And we don't want these to be politicized, and we want to find the common good. And it is hard because there are competing, concerns, and anything that becomes enshrined in federal law, there's a lot of red tape, right? So it is fundamentally a challenging thing. But I think that, that the right now, the movement that's ascended has taken advantage of that and is really exploiting it to the detriment of, I think, us all. Honestly, I think no matter how isolated you are from these practical concerns, like needing to have women's reproductive health care in a very rural part of a red state, even if you don't need that, society will suffer as a whole because we're treating our immigrant population so badly. We're treating our women so badly. We're treating anybody who's not a white bro, bad. And even many of them, are being treated badly, which is why they're sort of resentful, honestly, which I think we'll get into later today, probably.
Yeah. I mean,
And you're sorry.
No,
Can
go
I
ahead.
follow up real quick?
I was going to say that makes me think about something that Lauren and I kind of come to a lot on this podcast, which is that sometimes what seems like the intuitive policy solution is not actually a great solution, right? And so if you want to decrease demand for abortion, banning it counterintuitively may not actually be the way that you get good health outcomes, right? And so I think a lot for the people who are so motivated to put an end to abortion in the United States. Like, well, what else would you need to do to reduce demand instead of to solely focus on stopping a procedure, right? Because I tend to think of like behavior is very persistent. If you're talking about, sex, like good luck stopping that.
Yeah.
Like
right.
the track record on that is poor.
Yeah.
So like if we want to do something productive, then I think the question is, what will we need to do to achieve our outcomes that's maybe not the obvious, we'll ban a procedure.
Right. And we know how that went, right? We've done that experiment. I mean, I've just been reading with my, women's female body politic book group, this amazing new book by Clara Bingham called The Movement, which covers in a lot of, dozens of women's voices, what happened during the late 60s and early 70s, during the time when Roe became law. And it really covers what women were dealing with at that time, and it wasn't the case that people weren't having sex, right? People are going to do that. And, it was the dawn of really, available methods for birth control. It was the dawn of realizing that women were having to make very sketchy choices. There were these whole sort of underground railroad networks where women got, if they were poor, they often ended up septic and dying or infertile because they had these back alley abortions. And, so I think this is just something that they always want to roll it under the rug and be like, well, if women just got married to dominant men and it was all just, like the Handmaid's Tale, it would all be just rosy. But the truth is that we need to provide health care. I mean, I was honestly, I would not want to be, I understand I have women in my lab who are of reproductive age right now, but I would not want to be a woman of reproductive age in this country right now. Because even if you're married and you get pregnant and you totally intend to have the baby, there are a whole multitude of things that can go wrong. Honestly, carrying a pregnancy to term is more dangerous than having an abortion. And, and you're terrified when you're pregnant every single time. It's like, oh, well, what is going on? I mean, my sister-in-law had to have a procedure that was the only place that they could do it in Texas, where she got to her second trimester and the baby was inviable. It had all kinds of, organ deficits that were incompatible with life. And there are all kinds of women, dealing with those impossible choices where they have these pregnancies that are just not going to result in a live baby. And so, even if you want to deny women the choice up front, you're forcing them into really unconscionable, morally unkind or immoral situations with what we're doing now. I mean, we need to give people autonomy to control their own bodies and their own privacy and their own health care. I mean, that's just fundamental to being able to be a person in our society. I feel like I would totally go to the mat for this. It's just, it's if you don't have bodily autonomy, you can't do I mean, all this other questions we were going to talk about today, right? If you don't have the ability to control when and how you structure your life and your reproductive choices, you can't do any of that because you can't control your own fate, essentially.
Yeah. Well, so, to get back to so Chip had a question earlier, which Laura alluded to, which is like, so how do we sort of resist without furthering polarization, right? And so there's, a lot of my work is looking at sort of how binary thinking gets us, it digs us in even further, right? Like it creates this additional sort of us versus them. It animates tribalism. It does all this stuff that Laura's work points to. And then Laura had a great Substack this week looking at sort of like people who intentional,
Right.
and this I think goes to this question of like, when a lot of folks in particular on the right, when it comes to the attacks on academia, right, they're intentionally misunderstanding, right? They're not actually
Right.
trying, and they're actually intentionally misunderstanding as a way to encourage other people to misunderstand as well. But I think one of the things, to go back to that distinction, like, when we talk about the title of this podcast, we made this political. Um, I think it's really important to distinguish between like making things political and making things partisan. And that's where I think there's a way that we can sort of try to navigate these differences and really pull through the universal threads. And that's where storytelling, I think, becomes really powerful. So, one of the things that's come up, I think, a lot in some of the press are stories from folks in red states who realized, oh, hey, I had no idea that this is how this was going to play out, right?
Right.
I didn't realize that my wife is also a Medicaid recipient when she's pregnant.
Right.
And therefore, these cuts really affect our family. Or, I didn't realize that my husband would be at risk of being deported or, whatever. So I think, there's ways of it. And I'm a political theorist, so I do all sorts of annoying things and go back to Aristotle far too often. But, Aristotle's definition of politics was coming together to talk about a shared vision of the good life together. And it doesn't mean that like we're going to agree on everything. It doesn't mean that like we're in lockstep by any stretch of the imagination. Like he expected discord, he expected disagreements. But I think we do have to tell those stories that point to a certain common good. What do we want our country to look like, right? Do we want women to be denied medical care when they have an ectopic pregnancy because the life of that, the embryo, whatever it is at that stage, the blastocyst is interfering with her
Right.
safety. I think pro-life folks would say, no, that's not what we're talking about. But I think they need to see the way that legislators
Right.
are, how these issues are actually being manipulated.
Mhm.
So I do think we can do a better job of speaking to folks in red states. Um, I mean, and I'm sort of the three of us, I'm pretty insulated from this. I'm in New York. We have very, very strong protections across the board. And so it is like a little removed in some ways. But there's other ways that New York actually harms women in other kinds of spaces. So, I mean, I think there's always like I think we always want to sort of think about what is the common good
Yeah.
rather than thinking about like, what is my partisan platform and how do I preserve it,
Mhm.
right? Because once you
Right.
get into that mentality, it's no longer about the common good anymore. It's about winning,
Right. Right. Then it's
you know?
polarized. Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think that is
Yeah.
the case, that there are a lot of consequences that people, even on the right, or would consider themselves very staunch anti-abortion people, don't understand until they're experiencing it, until their wife is infertile, or they need IVF, or they need birth control because they've got 4 kids and they can't afford more kids. I mean, there are very legitimate reasons that I think span all of humanity and all of the people in
Mhm.
this country why. This is why opinions, but in many cases, we're making politics right now that don't fit with popular opinion. Even if you
Mhm.
take majority opinion, we right now are really allowing our politics to be driven by a very weird subset of people
Yeah.
who have very views that really don't match up with most of the public. I mean, most of the public think that in some circumstances women need to be allowed to have an abortion, because the other options, allowing a septic pregnancy or a miscarriage to kill a woman, is just not humane, right? It's not
Mhm.
humane right now what doctors are forcing women to do. It's like, oh, go home, and when you're bleeding out or you're gonna die, maybe we'll try to save you. I mean, that's just there's not too many people who would argue that we should kill a live woman to save a fetus that can't be saved anyway. And so I think there is a common good here, and I think there are common sense things. And I worry that the current politics is really getting in the way of finding those unions and of making those choices that make the most sense.
Yeah. 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 So what I had sort of this is like a bit of a maybe incoherent connection, but I wonder if you see any
Whoops.
connection
Still
between,
here.
uh-oh, did you lose me? Goodness. We lost Lauren. I'm sure she'll be back. Um,
No,
so without getting too far afield, oh, she's already back. Awesome. Okay.
there we go.
Hey,
Oh, you're back.
I never
Okay.
lost you, so it was weird. I was like, why? Where am
Yeah,
I?
you were
What's
your
going
little
on?
window just went away for a little while.
Oh,
Now
okay.
mine is flickering back and forth. I'm not quite sure what's going on there.
Mine's not. So who knows what people are saying at home?
There, mine
Yes.
is doing
Apologies, everyone.
something.
So I did want to, I wonder about the extent to which, some of this is, we touched a little bit last time on your work on, women in STEM. All three of us were at one point women in academia. We all went through PhD programs. We all were faculty, and the social sciences and the humanities. So Laura's background sort of harder social sciences. Mine is more humanities focused. Um, there's gender issues across the board, even in the humanities, which is female
Right.
dominated.
Right.
And so I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that, but I also wanted to throw out, and I haven't made the the causal connection quite clear in my own brain, but I wonder if there's a sense in which some of this backlash is the result of sort of the gains that women have made in STEM, the gains that women have made in academia. And so there's a certain kind of sort of threatening, right? It's easier to tear something down when you feel like you don't own it anymore.
Right.
And so, that's something I'm thinking about. I'm not sure exactly how the pieces fit together, but I would love to, just hear your thoughts on where you think equity is in STEM, particularly uh, from the perspective of sort of the federal attacks on DEI, and then just sort of how you're thinking about things both
Yes.
right now and moving forward.
I mean, it's been interesting watching this happen during my life because my generation has really been the first generation where women have come to parity in some departments as full professors, as, institutional leadership in academia. I mean, even when I was getting in, and I think I raised this, I mean, I never had a female mentor in my scientific career. And that was in part just logistical because the women weren't there, right? I got in and there were a few women, but they were very much in demand. They often did not have families. I mean, they kind of tracked. If you've read The Exceptions, which I would totally recommend everybody who's interested in women in sciences read, Kate Zarnicki, really journalistic masterpiece. She covered 16 women at MIT who were the creme de la creme. They were the women who made it. They had connections to people like James Watson, who were their mentors. They were really the best of the best. And even so, they ended up finding out across all these different departments at MIT that they were being systematically discriminated against. They were the first generation of women to be hired as actual tenure track, proper faculty. Most women of the generation even before that, so the generation 10 or 20 years earlier than me, the women would be hired, if at all, they would be a faculty spouse, and they would often have a non-tenure track position, or they would be a research associate in the man's laboratory. They would often, we have this situation at WashU, we have a number of female Nobel laureates, and at least one of them didn't even get tenure until she had received the Nobel Prize. They just did
Oh
not
my
consider
gosh.
her for tenure, right? It's like we don't put women on the tenure track, So we have these funny women. I walk by their pictures every day when I walk into my into my building to go to work, and yet you realize that if they got in at all, they got in because they were the wife of a man who was a very good scientist, and they had a position working with him in some cases very equitably, but in some cases as kind of his lab assistant, and they often didn't have those opportunities. And so these women of the MIT study, as it's called, the 16, discovered that they were at this institution, MIT, that was very prestigious. They were the best of the best. And nonetheless, Nancy Hopkins describes it as having at one point, getting a lot of blowback from male peers who should have been colleagues, many of whom were junior to her, and really, she should have had seniority. She should have had more prestige, more money, more opportunities. And these guys were part of informal kind of clubs where they learned, oh, you have this special benefit that you can take advantage of because you're part of our boys club. And she actually took a tape measure at one point when she was getting pressure to give extra space to these junior male colleagues to put their equipment in what she considered her space. So she took a tape measure. She measured the rooms and the lab space she had, and she figured out the inequality. And what always strikes me about that whole study is that that was this initial MIT report on that study was published in 1999. I took my faculty job in 2000. So our institution was really, which my department had one other woman who told me, oh, by the way, the lab space that I occupy had a woman in it before me, and she didn't get tenure. And I'm, you will, every time you meet a woman in these very male dominated scenes, and I found it in my very first lab that I ever rotated in, which was with a really, prominent fly neurobiologist. The lab was 20 male postdocs, 2 female technicians, and 1 female medical student. And the female medical student told me, your rotation has got to go really well because here you're representing all men ever. Yeah. So that's the kind of message that you get. I mean, I'm a first year graduate student. I'm like, okay, I'll try to do my best. But representing all women as a first year graduate student and knowing you're going into that kind of hostile environment where the men won't really give you the time of day. Some of them were just overtly, just grossly sexist. It's a tough environment to navigate, and so you do just in the case of the 16, they generally had successful careers. Many of them, it blew up their marriages, it blew up their family life. They didn't have the kind of life that people like me wanted to have, and that was the situation that I saw with a lot of senior peers at Berkeley, where the women that I might have worked for at Berkeley who were prominent professors, many of them didn't really have the life I wanted. They If they existed,
Mm-hmm.
they had come about because they were part of a faculty couple. They had a, family fortune. So they were coming back to science later in life because they had this special privilege that people like me didn't have, or they had just given up on having a marriage, having a family, having children, which I really wanted to do. So I kind of, at the time I married, my husband was a Berkeley classmate. He was from Harvard. He was really smart. He is really smart. And he decided ultimately he didn't want to go the academic route. But a lot of women who do this end up in academic dual career couples. And we now call it, we used to call it the two body problem. Now we call it the two body opportunity. So often, I mean, in my postdoc lab at Harvard Med, the men generally, their wives were in town with them and they were raising their families and they were having kids whenever they wanted to have kids. The women had to have a plan. From 18 years out, you got to have a plan. And often your prospective spouse or your romantic partner is going to be in another city for 5 years doing his postdoctoral training or his graduate training. He's not going to, just go and be the house husband for you. So, and you have to be both lucky and really, really organized to make it happen. I got pregnant basically 10 days after I got my first faculty position, which actually maybe I shouldn't have done that because it made interviewing for further jobs. I had 14 interviews scheduled, but I ended up canceling most of them because it was just really, challenging to go be on the job circuit pregnant and trying to do these breakfast, chalk talks where it's like morning sickness.
Morning sickness. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it became rapidly clear that was really not an approach, and I should just prop my VWR catalog up on my big belly and try and figure out what I was going to do in my new lab when I started it.
Well, it's funny because I wrote a little bit about Eleanor Ostrom's work. She's kind of one of my lodestars in terms of like just research inspirations. But she was rejected from all the economics PhD programs that she applied to. And eventually, she ended up in political science, and then it ended up becoming not only the first woman, but the first political scientist to win the Nobel Prize in economics. And so it's sort of hilarious, right? That they were like, oh, you're not good enough for us.
Right.
And she's like, well, okay. But she tells a story about, when she got into her PhD program, her mentor said, you just have to decide whether you want children or a career in academia.
Right.
And she chose to have a career in academia and a wonderfully successful one. And she poured, sort of her maternal instincts into her students. I mean, her students speak just absolutely glowingly about her as a mentor and really careful and thoughtful sort of caretaker of their careers. But that's a position she should never have been in. And I know it was a loss to her. But we often think about that as sort of like, well, that was like decades ago. But I remember, and Laura, I'm sure you got the same message. When I was on the job market, I was told point blank by other women, right? Do not get pregnant until you have tenure. And that's the rule.
Yep.
You don't do that, right?
Yep.
And so I waited until I had a book contract in hand, right? Like to get pregnant. But it was really hard to balance like the two different parts of my life. And part of that was that, yeah, exactly the disjunct that you point to, which is that men can rely on female labor in a way that females cannot rely on male labor, right? And so there's this asymmetry that really does affect academia in pretty serious ways. We still call it the two body problem in the humanities because it's much, much harder to, you can pull two people into a lab who but it's really hard if you're already at capacity for historians, you just can't hire two historians who
harder.
you don't need. So we have folks who are raising kids apart from their spouse in other cities because they can't find jobs together. So it calls for a lot of really hard choices. And even today, the research demonstrates that women they bear the burden of those really hard choices, academic women across the board.
There are papers, and this like infuriates me. There are papers showing that when male and female academics take parental leave, men are more productive during that time, and women are less productive. And having had 3 children, I will tell you, I know exactly why that's the case.
Oh yeah, hell yeah.
And that just enrages me. And I have to say, so I went to get my PhD. I started at age 30.
And I remember talking to other male faculty members, and they were doing the math in their head, and they were saying, okay, so 4 or 5 years to get your PhD, you'll be 35. 7 more years to get tenure, you'll be
40,
42.
right.
That's really old to start having children. Have you thought about that? And I ended up having a baby during my PhD program. I had my second child while I was on the job market, like in the middle of the job market.
Right, like me.
Um, yeah, and it was hard, and I got the message indirectly that my choice to have a child during the PhD program made them wonder if I was really serious about
Right,
my career.
right,
And
exactly.
this is in a department that is marketing is very has women very well represented. And it was actually other women saying this. So
Mhm. And that's
like
so sad,
this
right.
culture toward this academic how academia views sort of life decisions is really I think is really unhealthy.
Yeah,
And the thing that strikes me now is being outside of academia and hearing how companies look at parental leave. It's far more humane, right? Like they're just like, oh, you're having a baby. Okay, you'll be
yeah,
back in 3
have your
months. Like
parental leave,
that's cool.
yeah,
We'll get your responsibilities covered. And then we'll move on. And it wasn't like that for me at all. And in fact,
yeah.
Clemson University told me they had no official HR policy for maternity leave.
Right. We didn't either. Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
when I
So,
was up for tenure, so I joined in my lab, I started my lab in 2000 and I came with a 4 month old. And that was a really interesting year because I was
mhm,
moving, I was starting, we joked for years afterwards that we did everything except divorce, and
mhm.
we like moved across the country. We both changed jobs. I had a baby, it was, and I was trying to get grants and I was trying to apply for, and, I got hired in parallel with two men. And one of the really infuriating things when I was due to have my second was that these men, their wives took years off to
Mhm,
raise their children. So I was on the same tenure timeline as they were.
mhm.
At the time, our institution had no breaks at all, to the point where when I asked my department chair around the 2001, 2002 point, when I was thinking, well, gosh, I really need to have a second kid if I'm going to have one because I'm going to be too old otherwise. I asked him about this and he said, no, you don't get any break with the tenure timeline because that was not a thing at the medical school. So we got no break, no parental anything.
Mhm.
Um, and I took it as a plus that the guys were kind of like, oh, so of course you can deliver, and 4 days later you can teach a class or you can meet with a seminar speaker. There was just they considered me an honorary guy, and I took that as like a plus. It wasn't like a
Yeah.
negative at all. It was like, oh, they don't even see all the stuff that's going on behind the scenes. They just know that I can still function even though I'm having this baby. But basically, he my department chair told me, oh, you should wait till you have tenure or at least till you have your grant settled. And it was really intimidating because this is this
Mhm.
person who has, direct supervisory ability to promote you or not promote you. And he's telling me, well, that do you really need, he actually said to me, do you really need to have two children? And I was
Oh
just
my God.
like, yeah. Now we tell people, HR tells people you can't say that.
Yeah.
But that was direct advice that I got, and it was because this person had never supervised a young
Mhm.
untenured woman before, like never.
Yeah.
Our department was 17, 18 men, and this one woman who I greatly respect, who did tell me that, yeah, she was the only one, and the woman before her had occupied her lab space and had not gotten tenure. She did get tenure, yeah. So she was very helpful for advice when I was going through tenure, gave me some suggestions, looked at my paperwork. But it was a really lonely situation to be in a way. I had a senior faculty member when I was expressing milk, because I had my second one and I was back at work and we put the kids in daycare. And the daycare would always call me because it was like, even though my husband's 5 minutes away, he's working a
Mhm.
biotech job. I'm an hour away. I'm working an academic job. I have all these, great things, but they were like, call the mommy. The baby needs diapers. The baby has a fever, come pick up your baby. And you could not convince them not to do that.
Yeah.
It was just, there were just so many weird challenges. I ended up at one point, I was expressing milk in my office because we didn't have any facilities to do that.
Mhm.
And one of the senior male faculty comes up, and I have female graduate students in my lab, and he's like going to knock on my door, my office door, where I'm in there pumping. And the graduate student says, "Oh, don't do that. She's busy right now." And it was like, "Well, what's she doing in there?" You just got these kind of just the men just had no idea.
They have no idea.
It's not even
Yeah.
malicious. They just really had no idea. Like I was this weird, like alien creature that had been dropped amongst them. And they had no idea what to do with me.
I was actually really lucky after I got a faculty job, and this is sort of an interesting, like, counterintuitive example of how it can work. But I was the only woman in the department, all, otherwise all male. And but it was a conservative leaning department, and it was a very, and these were conservative, very family focused guys. And so my chair at the time had 4 kids, and we didn't have a maternity leave policy at all. But he just said, "Oh no, we're going to figure this out. You're going to be able to take a semester off." And I think, from his perspective, it was, and this kind of goes into this thing that Laura and I have talked about before, which is like, bureaucracy versus human connections.
Mhm.
In his case, he had this young female faculty member who he really admired. We got along really well. He obviously wanted to keep me. Um, and he also had 4 kids and understood. I mean, he had seen what his wife had gone through. And so from his perspective, it was easy for him to say, "We're going to figure this out. We're going to take care of it," because family was a real priority to him.
Mhm.
I think
Yeah.
once you get into the large research, the bureaucracy of research institutions, it's much easier for this sort of like individual, like sort of element to drop away. I think it's harder for people to see. I mean, we were a small department, so we were 10 people.
Right.
So I knew my chair very well. We also didn't have all of the bureaucratic infrastructure of grants and labs and all the things that like need to stay online in a variety of ways. And so my experience was super positive because I had someone who was really, he felt that family life was important and balancing academic and family life is important. And he was going to make that work for me. And I am deeply, deeply grateful to him. I have 3 kids, and each of those kids I got, very good maternity leave. We eventually had, I think for my second daughter, we actually had a formal maternity leave policy. Maybe it didn't kick in till the 3rd,
Mhm.
but either way, I felt really well taken care of. But I think one of the problems in academia is that that's so hit or miss
It is.
because
Yeah.
we are so, I mean, I think you're actually more likely to get it in a lot of spaces. I've heard more positive stories from people in small departments.
Yeah.
I've heard horror stories from people in really large departments where it's just like, no, 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 you're a sort of, we're not going to say this out loud, but you're a cog in the machine.
Yep.
Maternity care interferes, or maternity leave interferes with our machinery.
Yeah.
Make this as least
Mhm.
disruptive as you can. Right.
Yeah.
So what does that look like on our end?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the ways that STEM is so different from other areas of academia, which is like I remember talking to a woman in biology who came back from maternity leave, and all of her like fruit flies had died because nobody
Right.
had
Can't do
like
that.
thought
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
help her. Like, and she had tried to set up systems, and so she lost like years of research because like nobody had thought to just help her out, right? So
Right.
so these are the kinds of things that I think STEM, I think there's a reason that women in STEM, there's been much harder um barriers, because I think you have, in addition to the sort of just general, a lot of men just do not get it. But I
Mhm.
also think you have this additional layer of bureaucracy on top, which is that like the grant timeline stuff is so much more unforgiving.
Unforgiving. Yeah.
The journal, like, just all of the things that I think STEM faculty have to deal with it's just a different space. And therefore I think women, there's just a huge barrier.
Right. A lot of women are just intimidated to even try it.
Mhm.
I mean, I've talked to a lot of women over the years at various levels, and I'm really pleased that I've been able to convince some of them that you can do it, even if the system doesn't make it easy for you. It is true that it's really, I mean, you have to kind of, these arrangements don't exist at a systemic level until they've existed at a kind of informal, I made
Yep.
for myself. Well, can we make it work for other people? Go through it and you manage to negotiate it yourself. And in my case, it was exactly that was the, well, okay, I've got to invest. And I know Amber, this pre and these stuff at this.
Oh, we're losing you, Kristen. Just you're breaking up a
Oh,
little bit.
oops. There we go. Are you?
Yeah, now you're frozen. Is she frozen on your end, Laura?
Yeah.
Oops.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, let's go there. If could it floating?
You're kind of coming back in and out again. Oh, now you're frozen again.
Okay. Oh, I see me, and I'm not flickering anymore.
That's a little better.
Yeah.
Oh, so we have it. We made it 47 minutes. So that, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, these are fundamental challenges that everybody faces that, if you have a supportive environment and you have a few good mentors in many cases, we're actually at a parity in my department, remarkably enough. So when I started in faculty position, there was only one woman who'd ever been on the faculty and gotten tenure and is now a senior, person with an endowed chair and everything. So we had never had a female chair at the medical school, but in 2008, my chair, Lila Solnika Kretzel, came on, and she was the first female permanent chair at the medical school. And it's amazing what having a woman as chair does for your faculty representation. Over the last, 10, 15 years while she was chair, we basically achieved equity in terms of gender balance in our faculty. And, it's wonderful. It changes the entire climate of the institution. And we finally had a junior faculty member come with a baby, and she pregnant with a second, just doing it. And it's remarkable for me to see, because when I went to do that same thing, I got a lot of the, oh, well, we've never dealt with this before. And like you say, with respect to the fruit flies all dying while you're on maternity, I was basically told by men, oh, it's just like if you got cancer, why would we give you a break on the tenure timeline? Because it's just like if you cancer. And I was like, yeah, right. And
Well, maybe that's not great either.
you
So give that person, yeah.
I wanted to just I've wanted to bop a lot of men on the head over the years, because they make these clueless comments that clearly are, really kind of inhumane. And, I was just kind of told, well, if you want a lab to return to, you better keep showing up because, the science doesn't wait, the model organisms don't wait, things need to be maintained. So I just I worked up to and past my due date both times. I was back, interviewing students and doing, admissions and doing all my responsibilities and my teaching shortly after I gave birth by C-section. And you have to hope. I imagine a lot of women would try to do that. Biology would get in the way. If you have any kind of problematic pregnancy, God help you. I had C-sections for both of them, but I was still back by 4 to 6 weeks later. And we had very good childcare that was affiliated with hospitals and where they did developmental assessments of the kids. And, it was really, it was good, but it was still hard. And so I think telling women coming through, you have to make a plan from age 18. You have to know it's going to be hard, but you can do it. And, others have done it. And, that would be the message that I would want to send out to people is don't be scared of this, do it. And, you will make it work. Others have made it work.
Yeah. What are some structural changes you can, I mean, obviously I think like having, like reasonable maternity and paternity leave is important, provided the paternity leave is structured correctly.
Right.
But I wonder what other, like, are there broader systemic, and obviously like within the context of like loss of NIH funding and all these other things like that, this conversation gets even harder because it's harder to institute like meaningful changes when the whole system's under attack. But if you could think of structural changes, like either in like the way grants are organized or the way the publication, like, are there specific things that you think would, and I say this too, not just like, it's not just a gender thing. I think it's also just, there are a lot of men who make real sacrifices of their family lives and their personal lives because they're dealing with the same thing. And so, you know, I think a more humane academia, so like not necessarily sort of just aimed at women, but like how could we build a more humane academic space for humans who have many different passions,
It's in real
not
life.
just one. So I don't know if you have thoughts on like sort of that piece, the structural piece. Like, are there bigger picture things that we should be aiming toward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually is one of the advantages of going to this sort of team science type approach now is that most projects have become team science, and what that it creates some issues because you have to maintain the team and you have to figure out who's going to do what when, but it also creates a kind of humanization of the whole enterprise because people are working as a team. They I have colleagues who will publish the most entertaining out of office, notifications. They're off with their families. They're off with their kids' scouting troop. And this is men too. So I think, men are taking advantage of this in ways that really humanizes the whole enterprise. They're realizing that everybody, not just women, not just people with children, needs to have balance in their lives and that we need to be able to be both academically successful, but not to have it eat our lives. And I think at least with this generation, there's a sense that we should not have to make those sacrifices. We shouldn't have to just decide that we're only going to be academics. We're going to be, as my husband would say, the monks and nuns of science, and we're not going to have a real life. That I mean, at the time when I was deciding whether to go into a career in science, I sort of thought, well, my husband will be the one who has the professor position, and I'll just get a job, and it'll be fine, and I'll have my life and all of my kids and whatnot. But the thinking that was the compromise I had to make at the time. And then when I realized, well, that really isn't a compromise I have to make because I can do this. And so I think it's really important that we, imprint upon the next generation that this is no longer your father or your grandfather or medieval scholars version of science, that we're going to have families, we're going to have kids, we're going to have, real lives, and we're going to do cutting edge science. And in a way,
Also,
yeah.
but that's not a compromise, right? Like that is a path to better science. Like the more well-rounded humans with more experiences, right? Pursuing more ways of existing is going to make the entire enterprise better.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's really important. I think that part of what has impaired science, and in fact, is this kind of notion of the mad scientist, this person who's really kind of antisocial, who doesn't appreciate. I mean, I think this is honestly, to get to politics a little bit, I think this is a little bit what's driving the malfunction of the oligarchy right now, is that these are people who really don't appreciate or have empathy for others in society. They think they're a dominant class of a few guys who are going to do it all and screw everybody else. I think that we really need to be a nurturing society, inclusive society. And I think that, if people have those options in their own lives and they have that kind of life themselves, they're going to be much more amenable to other people also having it and to fostering it. So,
yeah. I also think so. So Michael had a question, which is, whether academia really is structured that differently from other large entities like corporations advertise parental leave as a way to compete for professionals. And I think I've been now at my institution for 18 years, which feels like a lifetime. And I do think that this has changed really dramatically in the last 10 years. So I think when I talk to female faculty, it was very rare 10 years ago, 15 years ago, for there to be a formal maternity leave policy or a formal parental leave policy. Now, I don't know of any institutions that don't have something. And so I think there's been this huge shift. So to your point, Michael, I think academia is catching up. Not all industries are good about this across the board, right? So a lot of it does have to do with how competitive you need to be for employees. I think academia has become more competitive, and so it's easier to, they want to attract really top talent, and so maternity leave, paternity leave, parental leave broadly is part of that now. But But this to me, at least, and I don't know if you guys see the same thing. I mean, there's been a huge shift in the last 10 years.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think the FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, really did a number on academia in a good way. Our institution, between the publication of the MIT study, which led them all to do serious scholarly work in the early 2000s toward are we really giving women the same benefits packages? Let's not, let's not be discriminatory. And then the passage of the Family Medical Leave Act, which really mandated that if you have employees who've been around for more than 6 months, all employees, faculty, postdocs, students included, need to be given a certain amount of time to take care of family matters. And that just kind of, it means that you're not asking for special privileges. You're just saying that everybody who has these everybody has these issues in their lives. Everybody has the need to have a balanced life, and we need to set up policies that allow that. So yeah, academia has been very slow adopter of these things because they would rather just live on their old, feudalist sort of medieval approaches, which is why we all put on our fancy, hoods and our gowns when we go to the graduation ceremony, and acknowledge the past, but we also need to be looking at the future and thinking about what we can do to make life better for our trainees.
Well, and FMLA is a really good example, actually. Like a number of the people I've known in the last 5 years who have taken FMLA are men, and they're taking it to take care of,
elderly parents,
sick spouses or elderly parents. An increasing number of us are in the sandwich generation, so we're taking care of young kids at the same time. And so it does go to thinking about gender equity, and this is where I think this goes back to Chip's question at the beginning, right? When we sort of pit it as women versus men, then that does create this kind of false binary. But gender equity policies are good for everyone because really it's about humanizing academia. It's about creating spaces that humans want to work and humans want to contribute to. And Laura's point, which I think again is really often overlooked, is if you have a postdoc that's putting off their long-term hopes and dreams and working 18 hours a day and just brutalizing themselves, that's not going to be a good scientist. They're going to get burnt out. They're not going to be doing really high quality work because their brain is literally under severe stress. So I just think you will get better long-term outcomes if you think about what humans need to flourish. And I think we're starting to get there, but that connection has not been brought out in a lot of these conversations.
Yeah, but I think that's a little bit, it can happen regardless of what happens at the political and national level, which is one of the positives. I think that we will suffer as science as a whole takes this assault and, grants get harder to get and it changes the whole landscape of everything. But I think that these institutions have made major steps forward, and I hope that those will be preserved and that people will be able to take advantage of them and won't feel the need to go abroad. We'll still feel like there's a chance for them to do good science in this country. So
yeah,
hope for that.
I want to put in a little plug for an internal, if there's any academics on the call, the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity. They have a very confusing National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity. Yes, NCFDD. They have a faculty boot camp, they call it. And it's a semester-long program. And one of the things I loved about it, I coached for them for years. I did the boot camp when I was just had a baby, and then coached for them for years. But one of the things that they really emphasize is the first half of the program is how to get better about time management, which a lot of academics are pretty terrible at. And then the second half was work-life balance. And I was working with these brilliant scientists, and they would come in the second half of the program. They were terrified to take the weekend off. They were gripping on by their fingernails. But by the end, they would come in and they go, I took the weekend off. I didn't check my email 15 times while I was playing with my son. I didn't do and so I think we're actually getting better culturally at having these conversations. It's actually okay for you to let go for a second. In fact, you'll be a better scientist on Monday.
Right.
If you just don't check in with your lab 15 times on Saturday after.
I made that decision early on because I had to, because I was I was gonna enjoy my kids' childhoods. I was going to have a family life. And I mean, I did when I was in grad school, we did work all weekend. It's still startling. I go back to my journal
Mhm.
entries that I wrote back then, and I was like, oh my God, I was like working all of Saturday and Sunday. And my husband and I would try to find time to like have pizza dinner or a movie or something, you know. But I just when I got this job and it was basically desktop publishing, I appreciate that, the stem cells need love every day. And so the postdocs are in there tending them and doing a lot of work on the weekends. But I just called it quits. I said, I have to have a weekend because
Yeah.
otherwise I'm just going to be fried. I'm just going to be burning the candles for both ends. And so I do really appreciate when people just tell me, I want to take this day and I'm going to be with my kids and then they're going back to school. As long as
Mm.
people are doing their work, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And so if people appreciate that, I value them and I value their long-term contributions. And it's not all about, ticking a box or, being on the clock for anything. It's about the
Mhm.
long-term scholarship that we do. I think if more people get that attitude sort of baked in, and that's just kind of how academia operates, as well as how hopefully all of life operates, I think it would be better for all of us.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yep.
absolutely. Well,
Well, we
should we
like
wrap up
oh,
with a
sorry, go ahead,
hopeful thing?
Laura.
I was gonna say, should we wrap up with a
Yeah.
hopeful thing? Um,
Yeah.
I feel like we've shifted from from a little bit of like
Efforts.
fury to more hopefulness, but
And once again,
Kristen,
we didn't use any of the scripts, so we have
no,
all that for our essay or whatever we write in the future.
we could write a lot of essays.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think some of them need to exist. So
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. Well, Kristen, what are you hopeful about this week, or looking forward to next week, or the long term? Like we've been talking about where science is headed.
I mean, I think we're coming out of this position where we were all just kind of freaking out, right? This whole thing happened and it was so unexpected in a way. I mean, it was expected in some ways and that we knew that something had to give, but it was very unexpected to see this collapse of American democracy over a very, very short kind of unprecedentedly short time period. And then to see all the knock-on effects on all the things that we do in various, um, areas. And so to see people responding to that in a very rational, real world way and being like, well, we're just going to do us. We're still here. We're still doing the real work. We're still teaching people on the ground. We're still, America still has a good heart. There's still a lot going on that is very positive, and it's easy to lose track of that because the politics and what you see on the national level can be so negative and so sort of relentless and difficult.
Mhm.
So, but when I go into lab every day, it's these same very smart, very talented people who want to make a place for themselves in the world and are doing all the right things to get there. And so I'm hopeful. I mean, I think we have good bones for this democracy. I mean, we
Mhm.
may be suffering from a real issue of leadership right now or lack thereof, but I think we're going to get through this, and I'm hopeful, and I think regardless that these trainees are going to make the world a better place, whether they hopefully do it in the United States or elsewhere. I know they're going to do great things. So.
That's great. Laura, do you have anything? I was thinking about what you were saying, Kristen. It was kind of reminding me of this sounds a little bit dark, but I mean it differently. Amanda Ripley wrote this, that after 9/11, one of the things that changed was you were never again going to be able to hijack a plane full of people because passengers weren't going to let you. And I think my hope for what we're going through right now is that people are changing how they look at political engagement, and also becoming voters who are not going to let you. And I think one of the problems with the way we're doing politics right now is that there's this kind of focus on Washington and the president as though the rest of us don't have agency and control. And I think people are remarkably uh, you know, intrepid and persistent and deliberate. And like you can try and change systems,
but a lot of the time the people won't go along with you, right? And so I hope, my hope is, and I see a lot of evidence of this, that we are changing how we look at politics instead of it being something that's done to us, that we say, "Oh no, I'm not gonna
Doing
go
it,
along with
right.
this."
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I think taking agency as citizens and as
Mhm.
groups of citizens, I think there's a lot to be had there. I mean, in a
Mhm.
way, we kind of grew up in this era where it was easy to be complacent because
Mhm.
Washington was doing what Washington was doing, and we considered that kind of, that's dirty. We're not going to get involved. We're just going to do
Mhm.
our own thing. I think there's been a wake up call, and I think people realize that they really do need to get engaged and
Mhm.
engaged at a very grassroots level. And I think that can only be to the good, if people really take control of their own politics and their own society. That can
Yeah.
only be to the good.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Kristen.
Talk with you guys.
Yes.
Have a great weekend.
Bye.
Bye. You've been listening to We Made This Political with Laura Forcum and Lauren Hall. You can find us on Substack, Instagram, or LinkedIn. The podcast Substack is We Made This Political. Laura's Substack is How to Human, and Lauren's Substack is The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life. Subscribe and share if you like what you hear, and please also rate and review on your favorite podcast platform. That really, really helps other people find our work and means a lot to us too. Thanks for listening.